Leaders Alliance, MECLA. Today we will shine the MECLA spotlight on Scope 3 emissions. It's a complex topic and we have a stellar lineup of speakers to help build our understanding. My name is Hudson Worsley from Precinct and I have the tremendous pleasure of being the chair of MECLA and for hosting today's event. I'm joining you today from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I would like to acknowledge that we are all on Indigenous land. I pay my respect to elders past and present and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Turning to the mechanics of this session, we are recording the event and the event is being viewed by over 400 people. That was our registration number, so welcome. Thank you for joining us. We'll be running this as a webinar format, so please use the chat function for comments and questions. I'll be scanning those as we go and putting those questions to the panel, but also panelists may no doubt jump in and answer when they're not addressing us directly. As always, I'd like to remind all MECLA members and attendees today of our governance requirements. We don't tolerate any anti-competitive behaviour and we operate strictly in a pre-competition environment. If you are aware of any conflicts of interest, please speak up and we'll adjust accordingly. Now, to help us understand the boundaries and the measurement of Scope 3 emissions, we're joined by 4 expert speakers today, including a special guest who is dialing in from Geneva, Switzerland. Our first speaker is well known to MECLA fans, MECLA members. Hayley Jarick is the CEO of the Supply Chain Sustainability School. Her bio is so vast. Just have a look at her on LinkedIn if you want to know more. She'll be taking us through definitions, introductions to the scopes, and talking to us about why Scope 3 is so important. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing that introduction from Hayley. Then we turn to 2 colleagues from Lendlease, Anne Austin and Daryl Stuckey, who are both big contributors to MECLA. Thanks, guys. And they'll be taking us through the Scope 3 protocol document that Lendlease has recently released. And boy, I've read it, and it really pushes the conversation along for the very high bar of measuring Scope 3 emissions as part of their absolute zero target by 2040. So really looking forward to hearing from Anne and Daryl. And finally, we'll hear from Luca De Giovanetti, Senior Manager Business Environment at the Built Environment at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development based in Switzerland. Luca is a Senior Manager Built Environment, as I said. He leads the decarbonisation and circularity workstream for WBCSD. And the Built Environment Transformation Project. That objective is to take a systems-wide approach, close to MECLA's heart, a systems-wide approach to addressing whole-of-life carbon emissions of buildings with a performance-based view. Luke is engaged in various working groups of the Science-Based Targets Initiative that are linked to the built environment. So talking about addressing global trends, challenges and opportunities, looking forward to our final speaker, Luca. Welcome to you from Switzerland. All right, let's get on with it. Hayley, can I ask you to take it away, please?
Sure thing. I'm just going to share my screen with everybody and boot whoever's on there off. Excellent. So Alexi, sing out if it's not working. Otherwise, I'm assuming that it is. So I'm here to give the introduction. For those that know me, you'll know me that know that I work with the supply chain, both up and down the supply chain, which is essentially the Scope 3 of all the sustainability in the world. So in order to give you a quick introduction today, I'm going to run through sort of what that entails, why it's so important, and explain my title, I suppose, which is the other 90%. Okay. So this is not an error, it's intentionally left blank. And I want you to sort of imagine and step back that we're at the beginning of all time. You know, in the beginning, there was nothing. And then most people, this is sort of the journey of how most people then begin their measuring their carbon emissions journey. You start with literally a blank page and think, where do I begin? What am I supposed to be doing? And so everybody starts with scope 1. So for those that aren't aware of how the scope 1, 2, and 3 all work, scope 1 is essentially your direct emissions. So it's the stuff that you, from assets that you own and control. So that literally means, sort of in the building sense, it's all of, you know, the physical buildings that you operate in, the cars you drive, the trucks you drive, the fuel that you're putting in them and burning, in your cranes, your trucks, everything that's sort of included in your operations, everything that you own. And then most people sort of then go, okay, well, now that's scope 1, let's go to scope 2. And so essentially what scope 2 is all of the indirect emissions that are generated from purchasing energy. Okay, so this is, yeah, like literally you'll pull in all your electricity bills that you buy from the grid. You'll be measuring all of those kilowatts. You'll find out what sort of electricity you're on, and you'll add all those emissions in. And this is where most people are comfortable with. Not everyone's even up to this point of measuring their scope 1 and 2, and they can sit back and you know, relax, knowing that this is everything they're in control of. They're in control of all of their internal operations. They're in control of what they buy, energy they buy in. And then the fun begins, because this is the world of scope 3. And if you zoom out and sort of picture the rest of the world and turn on all the lights, this is what scope 3 then looks like. So if you think of everything up your supply chain, including things that you buy in, the energy that they use, they might then come from a storage facility, the energy that they use, it might be shipped in from somebody else, that shipping company, all of the energy that they use, all of the, then that might come from a mine or a quarry, and then it'd be shipped towards you, and then someone has to dig that out of the earth. And this is just a very, very, very simple upstream view of what a supply chain might look like. And also scope 3 then goes downstream. So it's then who are you passing your goods and services onto, and what are they doing with them? So this is my attempt at comedy when I say that if you're in the building and construction game, you might then sell to a property developer who lives in high rises and flies around in helicopters and all the energy that they consume. They might then lease an apartment to somebody who uses it as their home, and they hook up their electric vehicle, and they might sublet out that room to a student who then gets around on their e-bike as they sort of wander around the place. And of course, all of those downstream applications, you can imagine that in every industry, their upstream and downstream is going to look very different. And whilst this presents a very linear view of the world, ultimately what happens in supply chains is that it's not this linear. A lot of them there's a lot of joining arrows, there's a lot of arrows going back and forth from everywhere, there's a lot of trade and things that goes amongst this around this whole world. This is the crazy world of scope 3, and like I said at the start, this is the crazy world that I live in, right? It's the supply chain up and down, trying to educate, trying to talk through not just carbon but a stack of other sustainability objectives up and down the supply chain. And so it's no wonder that I think that the scope 3 is really just an acronym for the summation of carbon dioxide emissions from operations to purchasers and end users, which is the hardest range ever endeavored. So if you're trying to put all of that together, that's kind of where scope 3 is. It is massive. It is the zoom out view. It is all of a sudden there was light and we actually saw everything that's linked to everything that we're doing. Now, there are some really good guides that go into much more detail than my simplistic overview of what scope 1, 2, and 3 is. This is a really good summary of what all of this is. There's a view of this on the Supply Chain School's website that I can provide a link to, and you can jump in and learn more about exactly what's included in different scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions if you're keen to get in that space. And like I said, you know, I presented a really linear type of supply chain. And when most people sort of think networking, you know, often these really, I call them pretty network diagrams, really pop up. It's sort of me and then a key other person with a couple of lines off of that. It looks very orderly. And there's a couple of, you know, colored shades of green and yellow and orange in there, and everyone's happy with, yep, I've got my whole world mapped out in this beautiful network diagram that our good friends in marketing have turned into a really nice pretty graphic for us, and then everyone's happy with how this looks. But in reality, this is more like what a network diagram would look like once you even just go 3 or 4 tiers deep into your supply chain. There's usually, you know, you think about, I know organizations that would have thousands of suppliers, either products and service suppliers. They then their supply chains would then have thousands of suppliers. And you can imagine how quickly that this escalates into a massive network of organizations, let alone when you then start to track the emissions within those organizations and how the world flows between them, and how it flows into individual projects, materials, and everything else that might go on. So whilst some people might think this looks super crazy and gets all in there, this is sort of my bread and butter. And if you think that that's sort of complex just to map that out in a world of carbon emissions, then, let's consider all of the SDGs in this context. So climate action is one of the 17 SDGs, and certainly with the supply chain school, we provide education on all 17 of them and look to partner and track of all of those objectives. So it is the issue in this space is massive. When you're engaging your supply chain, it's not just going to be for carbon, it's typically going to be for a few different objectives. At the moment, a lot of people are tracking them for carbon, circular economy, modern slavery risk, and then including a lot of diversity and inclusion metrics from your suppliers down. There's not as much traction in the downstream aspects of who you're selling to, and mapping that back up. Everyone's sort of going from procurement up where they feel like they've got more control over where that's happening, at least to the first tier. So, I mean, not that I'm trying to scare everybody here, but I mean, the problem is vast, okay? And it blows sort of the scope of things out to be quite hard. But one thing that I am going to point out to you is that if you do start in this place, there's always something to do. Doing nothing is not an option because there are so many easy things you can get started and doing. If you haven't done your scope 1 emissions, absolutely get cracking on that. If you haven't done scope 2, easy. Just pull your bills out, start with your electricity, then move on to your gas, then move on to anything else that you might be buying in. And keep tracking of those things as it moves through. But essentially, there's this myth that if you start working sustainability, then you should look for the low-hanging fruit, because if you find it, there's this magic moment where you can pick the fruit off the tree and it's going to yield some amazing results for you. And I've spoken about this before, so I apologize if people have seen this before, but essentially that is a myth, and this is what working in sustainability looks like. The apples are off the tree, they're on the ground, we just need to pick them up. So don't go hunting around for things low hanging off the trees. There is plenty of super low hanging fruit like on the ground ready for you to pick up and start work in this space. So definitely just get cracking and take that first step as you move through it. So like I said, in terms of where we're at with the school, the reason why this is so an important space for us is because we effectively work in that network governance area of all of our fellows pay the way of the school to get together, and we educate the entire supply chain both up and down. So we're talking about collaborative, accessible education for a sustainable future. The way the school works is that anybody can sign up to become a member of the school. You can jump in and start learning. We also have fellows that pay annual fees to keep the school going, and not-for-profit organisations that partner with us to collaborate on developing all the resources to get together and to train everybody throughout the whole industry. There's a full disclosure, the Supply Chain Sustainability School partners with WWF and MECLA because we're both working in that same space around knowledge sharing and education around the embodied carbon space. So there's a lot of combined assets that we work together on to be able to do that. And obviously I'm part of a few working groups in the MECLA sphere as well. And the reason why I think that all of this is so important is that there's this old saying of a rising tide lifts all boats. So if we can educate the entire supply chain, if we don't just focus on our internal 1 and 2s, if we're actually pushing those drivers for people just to start measuring their own internal emissions and then sharing that data up and down the mainstream, then effectively the entire marketplace increases its capacity, and the escalation effect of what can happen if we all focus on reducing our carbon emissions, it actually has such a more impactful impact, a greater impact on the entire industry, because even though 1 or 2 people might be focusing on this, what that does is raise the tide and all of the boats lift up, and so we all benefit from that. And that's one of the great things that I found about working for the supply chain school. It's also one of the amazing things that I found about working with every member at MECLA is that just a couple of people doing the legwork or trying to get some resources and things through and developing these webinars and doing things actually improves the whole industry, whether you're in the leadership or not. And I think one of the amazing things that we're about to hear from the team at Lendlease is that they are that first boat. They're going to be in there and you're going to show them what they're doing in their scope 3 work. And I know that because when they lead that space, then other people will follow, and collaboratively we will raise the tide. So that is it from me. Hopefully I haven't gone too far over time, and no one's cut me off yet. So that probably means I'm doing okay. If you've got questions for me, pop them in the chat, and I'll come back and answer them at the end, if not live in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hayley. That's fantastic and great to hear of the work available to you. I love the idea of sharing data up and down the supply chain. And I think that's a great segue to our friends Anne and Daryl at Lendlease, because the exchange of data, of reliable, accurate and digitized data, is one of the key themes, I guess, underlying principles of the emissions protocol, Scope 3 emissions protocol, that they'll be discussing now. So Alexi, can I ask you to hand over to Daryl and Anne first, please?
I'll just do a sound check. You can hear okay, Hudson?
I can hear you well. No echo now. You've closed that off. Great.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, Hayley, and for, I don't know, both amusing and scaring people, I suspect. Adding to that depth of story that you just gave there to give a bit of context. Daryl and I work at Lendlease. We're an organisation that has a design and construction arm, a development arm, and an investment management arm with funds with around over 40 billion of funds under management around the world. We have 25,000 roughly first tier suppliers in our supply chain, and Lord knows how many each of them have, and we've got thousands of tenants. And so when we look at the whole area of Scope 3, we are trying to understand the emissions related to both of those entities, and that accounts for typically about 90% of Lendlease's overall emissions. So it's a really critical part of our emissions profile. And some people might wonder, if it's too hard, why would we bother focusing on Scope 3? Because all Scope 3 is somebody else's Scope 1 or 2, and shouldn't they be worrying about it? And there is some validity to that. But as influencers of those emissions, it's really critical that we take account for them, because they are so material to our actual impact on climate change and on the planet. So there's about 10% of the world's emissions are directly from things like materials and embodied carbon, etc. And if we were to ignore our role in that, we felt that would be really underplaying the part of a sector like ours in decarbonising. So we're going to take you through something we hope is going to make that journey a little bit simpler, because you might all be wanting to run out the door screaming. We're going to take you through a Scope 3 protocol that we have developed and recently published, which we're really keen to get some feedback on. Let me first start by giving you a little bit of context, though, as to why we have done this work. As Lendlease, we have set ourselves some pretty bold ambitions in relation to decarbonisation. We call it Mission Zero. And we've got two stages in our Mission Zero journey. The first one is that stage that Hayley mentioned, is often people's first one, for us to be net zero in our Scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions. So our Scope 1 being the fuels that we burn, things like gas, diesel in construction and also in our buildings to heat water and the like. And then we have a second goal, which is very bold, around 2040 mark. We are looking to be what we call absolute zero for Scopes 1, 2 and 3. So that's without the safety net of offsets. So looking to be fully eliminating not just our Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also our Scope 3 emissions. So those emissions that are coming from upstream from our supply chain, and also downstream from our tenants. So it's in that context that we have been leaning very deeply into what is exactly in our Scope 3 boundary. And what we have learned is that this is a vexed issue. As part of that journey, we've gone, well, we need to reduce our own emissions. We know we need to advocate for transformation, and we know we need to do that together and form partnerships like MECLA. So all of those sort of steps were quite clear. But when it came to then saying, well, exactly what's in that bucket where we need to reduce, exactly what's in that bucket that we need to advocate for transformation around, the greenhouse gas protocol is not as clear for Scope 3 as it is for Scopes 1 and 2. So when it comes to Scope 1 and 2, Greenhouse Gas Protocol gives very clear rules and guidelines. It's pretty hard to get those murky. But for Scope 3, it provides a fair amount of interpretation. So what we have done is conduct that interpretation. And we have published that in the form of a protocol. This is our first version, and we're going to give you a little bit of an introduction today into the why and what of that protocol, and just a taste of some of the sections that are in it ahead of us getting some opportunities, hopefully for future webinars where we can do deep dives for those who are interested in the technical details behind this. So what do we mean by a Scope 3 protocol? So we have proposed a global approach for measuring and reporting Scope 3 emissions for our sector. We have done this to help focus the carbon measurement and effort in the areas that we know are really, really important for us. So we wanted to make sure that we were being clear with ourselves about the types of Scope 3 emissions that were critical for us to be mindful of, because they have the largest impact on emissions globally. So we thought it was really important for us to define that boundary. That's going to be part of what helps us move towards absolute zero. But that first point that we have there about proposing a global approach, I guess, is the most important thing for us on this journey, because we're conscious that there's so much complexity around Scope 3. It would be a lot simpler if there was a common way of suggesting a boundary that was relevant for the types of sectors that we operate in, the construction, the development, the funds under management. And so this is our sort of gift as a start to that conversation. We know that there are others who've been thinking along the same lines, and what our hope is that we will all add to this together, so that we can have some sort of consensus as a sector around what would be in a Scope 3 boundary, which will make it easier when we start to reference our Scope 3 emissions in the marketplace, because there will be some sort of common language. So we're calling this version 1 because we fully expect that there will be version 2 and 3 and 4, etc. And we know that other parties, have already been part of this journey. A number of them have reached out to us along the way. So how do we get to where we've got to? Just to give you a sense of the journey to date. We started with our targets and trying to understand what it would take for us to get to absolute zero. My colleague Daryl has then had the joy of the next 3 or 4 steps on this flow chart of reviewing the greenhouse gas Scope 3 standard guidance as it stands now as part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, also examining 22 related guidelines and standards that support that current protocol, and then looking at a comprehensive scan of over 68 different corporates that are disclosing Scope 3 emissions now in the geographies that we operate in, which is Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas. So after all of that work, Daryl then went through an exercise of looking at the 15 categories that are recommended by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to be relevant to Scope 3, and breaking those down into some subcategories that would be relevant in our sectors, and working through which of those 15 actually makes sense for organisations like ours in this sector to focus on. We then, as a global team, looked at those, and we, over about 10 hours worth of meetings, we applied a series of different tests to them to come up with our suggestions of what we think should be included in boundaries related to Scope 3 in our sector. So the classification approach we have applied is applied to 8 of the 15 different categories that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol suggests. So you can see the 15 suggestions there for both upstream and downstream categories that sit within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The ones that we've highlighted in green, we feel are the most relevant in the sectors that we operate in, primarily based on their materiality and on the transitional risk and of their relevance to the type of businesses that we operate in. If you are perhaps just working as a contractor, a head contractor, you might have a slightly different interpretation on this. For example, the downstream leased assets would unlikely be in your bucket. But for us, because we have an investment management business as well as a development and construction, all of these 8 are relevant. And we've actually, in the protocol, pulled these apart to show you which ones we think are relevant for construction, which might be relevant for development, and which might be relevant if you are a fund manager of real assets. So then for each of those, we applied a test to the possible subcategories that sit under each of those 8 topics. We looked at relevance, materiality, the transition risk, and how important it is to think about this particular aspect of emissions when we're transitioning, and our own business goals, to land on 3 different categories that we have chosen for our emission types. The first category are things that are definitely in the measure bucket. It's been suggested to us we should have made that colour green rather than brown. So that's definitely something in version 2 that will be changing. So we've got a group of things that we think that's really obvious. That should be measured and is important to be included in a boundary if you are trying to eliminate your emissions, your scope 3 emissions. At the other end, we've got that's really not that critical, and relative to others, it's probably immaterial, or it's so impossible for you to accurately measure that it wouldn't be a sensible thing to be included. They're excluded. And then we have a bucket in the middle, which at the moment, it doesn't seem sensible for them to be measured and included within a boundary. But within time, that may change, and that there's a bit of a watching brief on that. And we're absolutely open to adapting our approach to this as we learn from others who have also been, on this journey. But this is our first pass at categorising that. And so we've published all this in a beautiful little e-book that's available on our website. We'll make sure the link goes in the chat. I think it might have already been in the invitation to this session. So this has been softly launched on our website, and you can see in the picture there the sorts of information that's provided in that. So we give a little bit of a definition of that particular category. We show you the things that we think are in those 3 buckets of measure, exclude, and in the middle, monitor. We give you a sense of the materiality of that particular aspect in our business, and so like a percentage proportion of how much of our emissions it accounts for, and then a couple of examples of the sorts of actions that we think we need to undertake, or in many cases have already begun, to drive those emissions down to 0. So Daryl's now going to take us through just 3 of the 8 categories to give you a sense of the sorts of things that we're looking at and to make some of that theory come to life. So Daryl, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Sorry, Daryl, you're still on mute. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go for it, mate.
Go for it, mate.
Thank you. So yeah, thanks, Anne. And as Hayley sort of alluded to earlier, the purchase goods and services category, which is really largely the upstream supply chain for us, is one of the most challenging areas, both from a measurement and a boundary setting perspective. So essentially the way we've looked at this is very much through the lens of life cycle assessment. So I think it's fair to say that the industry has become quite familiar with building level life cycle assessment and standards such as EN 15978. So we've very much looked at how we can align our measurement and reporting boundary to those sorts of standards. So you'll see we've pulled out directly purchased building products and materials, which would be typically under the EN 15978 standard, would be your modules A1 to A3, which is your product up to your product stage. And then we're also looking at directly purchased materials that would be which would be acquired during major refurbishment activities of assets that we may have maybe doing refurbishment work on. And also the materials that might be indirectly purchased by our organisation through engagement of subcontractors. So Anne mentioned before that we have around 25,000 tier 1 suppliers, but of that, sometimes we'll pass the actual procurement activities down the supply chain, and it will be a subcontractor that may be doing the purchasing on our behalf as well. So we recognise that obviously that still forms part of an important aspect of the embodied carbon within the building and something that we should be measuring. We're just sort of moving, I guess, more to the monitor category. We looked at use stage, again, B1 to B4, so products and services that may be acquired in order to, say, operate a building. A lot of those emissions for our business are already captured under our Scope 1 and Scope 2 reporting. So if we have a maintenance contractor, for instance, coming into one of our managed assets, the electricity they're using, or if they happen to be using liquid fuels to perform that maintenance activity, are captured under that Scope 1 and 2 reporting. So we felt at this stage, given our current business model, that it's not appropriate for us to be measuring and disclosing that, because we already are effectively, but obviously something we'd have to monitor if our business model was to change in that space in the future. So I think in terms of, just to give you a bit of a flavour then, in terms of some of the exclude categories, there are a lot of people that are using a top-down approach, using spend proxies to calculate an idea of the emissions. Obviously, with our absolute zero objectives, we need to actually be able to do quite a razor-sharp measurement on that into the future, which means we need to also get focused on what are the things that are most aligned with what our core business is. And our core business is obviously developing and creating assets and construction. So yes, there are, I guess, tertiary consumables and things that would be associated with office and administrative activities. However, we felt that in order to track, drive all of those small disparate sources of emissions to zero would be really take our focus off the real big end of town and hard to abate sectors that we're reliant on as an industry. So we're essentially not saying that they're not important, but they're far less material, and we felt it was prudent to exclude it at this point. So there's a few others there, but just given interest of time, I might just jump into the next category, which is use of sold products. This one largely relates to our development business. And again, we wanted to focus this on product that we create and sell directly to a customer. So we recognize that we do a lot of construction on behalf of another client. That's effectively a construction service as we see it, and the product is owned really by the developer. So we wanted to look at, well, what is the product that we develop and sell directly to customer, which is largely apartment product. And then also only look at measuring and disclosing the emissions associated with the use of the elements that we're providing as part of that initial build. So clearly, things that we were looking to exclude would be some of the plugged loads and appliances that an apartment owner might bring into their apartment and use. The other aspects that we're looking to exclude was then around just sort of operational aspects associated with the lifetime operation of that asset as well, and things that we would have far less control over, and are also potentially a lot less material than the fixed components within the building and the operational energy use there. So just moving forward just to downstream leased assets. This is one where we're quite open to having a lot more dialogue with the industry generally. We understand that there are quite a few differences of opinion around downstream leased assets and whether what should be included within that scope. At the moment, we measure and disclose all tenant grid electricity use, as well as any use of natural gas or liquid fuels. We are at the moment within the monitor bucket. We made the decision that we don't necessarily understand fully some of the industrial tenant activities. We have a fairly small industrial portfolio, but you still need to understand that we could have tenants occupying those large warehouses that are conducting manufacturing related activities and processes that may be quite difficult to work with them to identify a pathway to absolute zero. So at this point, felt we needed to leave it in the monitor and currently exclude bucket until such time as we could sort of wrap our arms around that and really understand how we might be able to provide the right incentives as part of our leasing strategies with industrial tenants to drive those to zero. So I might, again, in the interest of time, just step through to the last couple of slides we have in our presentation. So we're really looking to solve a couple of really key issues. And again, the focus of our measure and disclose category is really around how do we ensure that we've got a really clear focus on measurement and driving the harder to abate materials within our supply chain to absolute zero. And the other aspect that we recognise we really need as a sector and as an industry more broadly is to open up and create a digitised platform for sharing Scope 3 emissions data. So yes, there is data available. It is difficult to get. It is complex. There are different ways in which people obtain that data currently. We also recognise that there's a lot of requests both on ourselves, but then also on our supply chain as well for the same information in many different formats. So how do we sort of come together as a sector or as an industry to standardise the way that we capture that information and then have a platform where we can share that information seamlessly to reduce this reporting burden on everybody across the sector. So we're really looking to see how we can start to bring other people across the sector and technology partners potentially. And I think Luca will speak specifically to the PACT initiative and how that can also assist. But yeah, we're very keen to sort of open up the conversation in that space as well to see how we can solve that issue. So I'll just hand over to Anne, who just probably just do a quick wrap up on this.
So this is a soft launch. We're really keen for some feedback. I'm seeing some really interesting questions in the chat and the question, so I'll take the lead from Hudson as to if and when we can maybe come to some of those. That's exactly the sort of thing that the kind of conversations we want to start. We will be looking at a late September. We're targeting probably around the 24th to officially launch this. It'll be a face-to-face event and online nationally. We're looking at a government guest speaker and a panel with others that are on the same journey. So if you are already doing something similar and you haven't already reached out to us and you think that would be something that you would like to participate in, please do. And then we will also be running a more detailed page turn webinar. Well, I won't be, Daryl will be, where we'll go through all of the 8 categories for the specialists to kind of really argue out things and nut out some of the deeper questions. So check out the MECLA newsletter for invites in relation to that. So Hudson, let us know, do you want us to talk to questions now, or do you want us to do that after everyone's finished?
Why don't you take a few questions now? We're actually slightly ahead of time. Daryl, you've been very disciplined in time management and not going into too much detail, but you're right, Anne, there are great questions in the Q&A. Why don't you tackle a couple?
Okay. So the first one that I can see here seems like Lendlease considers most of the downstream emissions associated with the use of their developments to be immaterial. Is that correct? No, that's not correct. So maybe when Daryl then started to take you through some of the examples, we definitely we're already trying to measure our downstream emissions. We have to do that as part of our GRESB requirements for our funds under management. So we are definitely considering our tenant electricity consumption and as fundamental, and that's something that I know some people have had some question marks around whether or not you can measure that. You have to at the moment, ask them nicely, or sub-meter. So when we've got new developments, we're able to put in some of that sub-metering, but at the moment we have been going through the process of requesting from tenants their tenant information around their own emissions to include as part of our scope 3. The other question, will Lendlease be considering the transport from suppliers to the project site, A4 stage, I think?
Yes. Correct. Yes. Obviously, is nested within a different category, but yes, definitely.
And then there's some really interesting ones in the Q&A. I'm just looking in, there's 2 different forums where people put questions. How does Lendlease balance the need for zero carbon and driving local sourcing improvements? With that whole sort of commentary, if you purchase them from overseas, potentially that might increase their emissions by the fact that they have to be transported and not supporting local. That's a really important area for us of focus. We do find that sometimes even with the addition of the transport, some overseas products can still be lower embodied carbon in totality than local, and that is something we are absolutely passionate to see change. It's one of the main reasons that we're in MECLA. It's part of us, wanting to support that, and we've been actively doing that ourselves. So, for example, some of you might have sat in on some forums where the work that we've been doing around low carbon aluminium facades has been tabled and discussed. And our first endeavours into that have definitely been using international suppliers, but we are now working very hard in the local market to see if we can crack an even better solution in Australia, because we all want to see this sector, Australia actually benefiting from supplying to a low emission space. But it is something that, unfortunately, probably driven by the legislative environment internationally, some of our international suppliers have had a jump on our local ones, and it's something we're very mindful of. Did you want to add to that, Daryl?
No, not really. I mean, yeah, completely agree. But yeah, what is important when you look at transport, as much as the distance, is actually more important is the mode. So you need to consider, obviously, the payload efficiency of what's being delivered. Shipping, yes, it has some impacts, but you can get huge payload efficiencies on shipping. So, in fact, it could be much better to ship something vast distances across the ocean than it might be to sort of transport it by truck from Sydney to Melbourne, for instance.
Kirsten, now there's suddenly a whole rush of questions now. Kirsten wants to know, what's our magic wand for business travel, because buses and trains are slow, and what the hell's going to happen with aeroplanes? So we're only looking at flights, we're not looking at taxis, etc. And I think that, yes, the whole, will the aviation industry ever get to zero? Will their fuel alternatives get them across the line? I think we've probably got all our fingers crossed for that one.
Yes, would be the short answer. But yeah, we obviously we recognise that there are a lot of smaller trips, taxis and things that are taken. There's obviously hotel stays, but again, we could run ourselves ragged tracking all of those really small movements, and it really just sort of takes our eye off the larger problem areas that we think for our sector and for our business, and not as material. There's a question too, just around Lendlease considers most of the downstream emissions associated with their developments to be immaterial.
Yeah, no, we talked about that.
Yes, but I mean, just so downstream use of products emissions. So what we're saying is no, but there are developments that most of our development work feeds into our investments under management portfolio, and then forms part of our scope 1 and 2 reporting as well. And so whilst our downstream use of products category may look smallish, it's because a lot of it is captured within our scope 1 and 2 boundary as well.
Hudson, do you want us to keep going?
No, I was about to say, look, that's probably a good spot to pause. I'm keen to bring our Swiss correspondent into the conversation. Let's pause there. Please encourage. I'm very much wanting to encourage people attending to continue with the questions. It's obviously questions of substance, and you're asking questions with a genuine open mind to what does the industry need to hear here. Really keen to come back to you, so stay on the line, you two. You're not off the hook just yet.
We can start typing some answers to some of the questions we didn't get to as well.
That's a great idea. So thank you both, Daryl and Anne. Thanks so much. Look forward to coming back in a little while to have a panel discussion. But now I'd really like to introduce Luca De Giovanetti from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He's joining us from his home in Switzerland. Luca, can I turn to you, please?
Sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for the introduction. I mean, I don't feel like that special just because I come from a bit far away. And I'm very happy to be here for two reasons. One, of course, because of this topic is highly relevant to the work we do and, well, I guess to the challenge we're all trying to address, but also because it's nice to be virtually back to Australia, where I spent I've been living there a couple of years ago. That's a bit more than a couple, but yeah. So it's nice to be connected again with Australia. So yeah, my name is Luca De Giovanetti. I work at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and would like to just kind of provide an overview. I have two presentations. One is about the built environment, the work we are doing, and how it connect globally, and the other one is related to the partnership for Carbon Transparency Pact, which is also led by WBCSD, and I think is also very much relevant to the aspect of data sharing and exchange to measure Scope 3 emissions. So with that, I'll maybe starting by, briefly mentioning WBCSD. So we are a global community with leading businesses. We engage in our membership over 200 global companies, and really trying to address the challenges that they are related on sustainability, mainly focusing on the climate, nature, and inequality. So these are the key sustainability challenges that we see, and how we address that across the different system to really drive the system transformation. So, and the idea is really to make sure that all companies are really working and collaborating to achieve and address these challenges. So, and when it comes to the built environment, well, I guess we all know about the 40% or so global carbon emission related to the built environment, the increased loss in nature from the material extraction and so on. And then, of course, the inequality when it comes to the housing and other conditions that are related to the built environment. So what we want to do is really to drive this system transformation and engaging all businesses to help and tackle these challenges. So when it comes to the built environment, this is probably my favorite slide because it brings together what we do, why we do, and what needs to be done. So from our side is really the idea on decarbonization is really to accelerate achieving net zero emission across, on one side, the entire built environment life cycle. So making sure that we bring we consider all emissions that are related to the built environment, and doing this with a system-wide collaboration, really bringing together the entire value chain, but also all stakeholders that are playing a role in the system and active in this. So as I mentioned, the built environment represents 40% of global carbon emissions. And this is because of the, speaking about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, kind of you cannot imagine like the direct emissions of buildings, that on-site emissions represent about 20% of these 40%. Half of these emissions are the indirect emission from the electricity production. So if we consider that 50% of electricity is used in buildings, well, then we know how much is actually the carbon emission from the electricity production. And then the embodied carbon, the material, the manufacturing of building material, which also represent about 30%. So this is the challenge we need to tackle. And tackling this is not just about, well, on one side, reducing this emission, but also we have to be considering that the built environment and the building space is increasing, where we add the size of Paris every 5 days. So this is also the challenge, is the growth that we're facing in the built environment. And what we want to achieve, or what we should achieve, is really first halve emission by 2030. So really kind of course, peaking the emission, but then curving it down to half by 2030 if we want to really achieve net zero by 2050. And as in there you can see the objective, which is shared with globally now, I would say, is the shared vision of what needs to be done, is that net zero operational we should achieve net zero operational building no later than 2030 for new buildings, but then also making sure that all buildings are net zero in operation by 2050. And embodied carbon as well, is that at least we reduce by 50% the embodied carbon in new buildings, in buildings that get constructed, and of course net zero by 2050. So this, I think, is really just kind of the really the common vision that the sector should have. But maybe one thing to not to break the mood, but I think the global the Building Global Status Report from the Global Alliance for Building and Construction reminds every year that, well, we are not that much on track. So emission keeps going up, although there was a small hope during the pandemic when we saw a trend going down, but that of course was just unfortunately just due to circumstances. And yeah, so although we are really improving on the emissions, kind of the intensity, but because of we keep increasing the floor area, that actually make the built environment keep growing on emissions. So we need to work harder and really address that faster. So from the built environment, from our side on the WBCSD, we really take the system perspective, really looking at the built environment as a whole system. And as you see there, we really want to bring all the stakeholders together. And these are, on one side, the stakeholders that have an active role in the development of the building as an asset. So the building material, construction, owner, user, we really are the one that are directly making, contributing to the emissions, but also, and not maybe more importantly, but really kind of sometimes maybe neglected, is really the all stakeholders that have an influencing role on if and how building get constructed. So architect, engineering, developer, financial sector, they all have a role and responsibility, and they have a power to influence that. So, and really for us, it's important on one side to make sure we all look at the same problem in the same way, making sure we have a common vision and common language so that the dialogue can take place, because as mentioned in the presentation as well before, we need each other, or let's say the scope 3 emission is the emission of somebody else. So we need to then the contribution of getting the collaboration across the entire value chain to make sure that each one is able to achieve their objectives. So, and that's why the importance of really engaging all stakeholders, being the entire value chain, so the private sector stakeholder, but then of course policy and science and academia. So the entire system need to work together if we want to address this huge challenge. So, And that's why and important for us as well, and I have a slide after on the market transformation on how we engage and what is the role and responsibility of the entire system. So these are the company that we engage in our project more actively, but that's kind of more directly than we engage really across the entire value chain, but also all the stakeholders. So, and these are some of the work. I just kind of laid it out like this, and then I just have a few information of each one, especially the one that are relevant for this network. So, but really kind of showing the journey that we have on publications that are related to how do we achieve the decarbonization of the built environment and the role of different stakeholders, but also importantly to mention one of the publication here is also the circularity. Circularity being a key business model to address climate and nature. So circularity is not necessarily a goal, but it's really a key enabler to achieve then the objective of reducing carbon and nature impact. So maybe starting with one slide that shows how to measure carbon emissions in buildings across the entire life cycle. So this is a framework that we developed with our members and other stakeholders a couple of years ago, and it's really just a simplified way to demonstrate and provide information of where and when carbon is emitted in buildings. So understanding where these emissions take place enables as well to make decisions or take steps to reduce these carbon emissions. So on one side, what component of the buildings are responsible for the carbon emission, and when in the life cycle of a building these carbon emissions are emitted. So this enable to kind of simplify or kind of visually understand as well these carbon emissions, and enable to understand what are the aspects that are potentially impactful and needs to be addressed further and how. So that's where the next step, what we did after it was to develop case studies together with Arup on putting the numbers in this framework so that it enables really to kind of visually see where these carbon emissions are taking place, how these are relevant, and what is the total impact of buildings. And then by knowing where we are or what is the amount, then it becomes easier, or it should become easier, but to set then mitigation targets, to understand what should be a limit that should be achieved. And then this enables as well different stakeholders to do the relevant decision on that by understanding what should be the desirable or maximum embodied carbon or operational carbon or entire life cycle carbon. So these are then kind of relevant for stakeholder government when they set procurement, for example, as well, maybe science-based target when it sets kind of what could be trajectory for decarbonization and setting these limits. So, so this is really kind of, the idea was really to demonstrate where this emission takes place and demonstrating that. So I think this is something that we have seen then replicated by other stakeholders and really appreciated by kind of the way that it simplifies the way we look at emissions. Of course, behind that, there is a lot of calculation, and that's where the challenge of consistency of data and consistency of calculation is important, and alignment on our life carbon. So the other work, and I think this is probably even more relevant for the network here, is really the work we presented at the beginning of this year on halving construction emission today. So how can we halve the construction emission? If we really say that we want to reduce embodied carbon by 50%, how can we do that? What is needed to be done? And in the report, happy to share the link, or you can see it there, or share more information. But really, on one side, what are the key considerations that could be taken or be considered, but also for the different layers, what are measures that happen that can be done? And an aspect, for example, that is important is that it's not sufficient to procure the lowest embodied carbon material. That, of course, is one important step. But then it's also really important on how this gets used and how can it be used more efficiently. An example that maybe that I like to use is the cement and concrete. So of course, you know, we can procure the lowest cement, embodied carbon cement, which is an important step to do. But then how do we then use the cement, less cement in concrete, so that we have the concrete with the lowest embodied carbon, because it's actually using less cement. But then also, probably even more important, is that how we use less concrete in the structure. So let's say not necessarily substitution, which is also an important thing, but it's important to look at the performance of that product. But actually the how do we make sure that we use the right quantity for the function we need? So if we can build a structure with 50% less concrete to deliver the same function, that's a 50% of carbon reduction. So it's really this kind of opportunity. And the idea is really of this report is to show where and how these are opportunity available. And the fact that we need to think ahead, really upfront, is really the most important, and think systemically. What are the various opportunities? Because there is no a single solution. So we really need to think coherently. So, and one important aspect is that we need to do this decision now, because the building that will be constructed in 2030, they are in the drawing board now. So the decision, the right decision needs to be taken now. We cannot wait until 2030 because that's too late. So this is the presentation. And then the last two is really on one side on the market transformation work. How do we look at the system as a whole, and what are the key enabler and key levers that would drive the transformation? So this is a work we developed together with other global ABC members as part of the market transformation. It was presented at COP26 2 years ago, and really looking at what is a common language and collaboration of the all stakeholders, a key enabler, and driving the levers for change, being aligning on all life carbon, really making sure we take the all emissions into consideration, integrate carbon and cost. Let's say in the fact that kind of the way we do decision on cost, we don't know yet the carbon cost of this decision. So we should make sure that when we take decision, we also aware of the carbon aspect, and really driving and changing this supply demand dynamic, because by looking at driving the demand, we can really change the supply as well. Now we're working on identifying better intervention area that links to that, and making sure that all stakeholders are empowered to do their own right decision to do the change. So, because the idea is that, you know, it's not just, oh, I need you to do this and then I can do that, but actually what can I already do myself now that will enable this system, and therefore enable other stakeholders as well to do their own thing. And the last things I want to bring up with the global ABC happening currently and coming up to COP28 and later as well is the building breakthrough. So France and Morocco are jointly co-hosting the building breakthrough, which is part of the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda with other sectors and so. And this is really kind of a new governmental effort to really highlight and elevate the role of the buildings to tackle climate. And currently there is about 20 countries that have joined, and the idea is really to make sure that the buildings and the built environment is elevated as part of the global agenda. One important stakeholder is Australia, that is not yet part. So if any one of you has relevant contacts with the Australian government, especially the department responsible for building codes, will be great to connect and make them aware of this initiative, and making sure that they join this, but also they will join upcoming global building and climate forum, which France is organizing for beginning of March next year. We really aim to bring together the largest countries, the minister of the largest country responsible for building. So this is from the built environment. So from here you can see my contact details in case you need. And I will then now briefly just mention as well the other initiative called PACT, Partnership for Carbon Transparency. So this is not something I work directly, so I can share information, but I'm not maybe the most expert on this, but I know sufficiently to present it. So I think one important aspect of the partnership of discussion on Scope 3 is that Scope 3 is not a nice thing to have. Is more and more increasingly also a business criteria for business operation. So there is more and more decision and criteria and policy, but also other regulation that really look at Scope 3, making sure that is accounted correctly, but also there is decision being taken around it. Science-based target with their new building pathway, but other initiative and really making that as a central consideration. So it's really important to make sure that it's tackled, measured, and addressed by business. So the PACT is a platform for data exchange that develop a protocol for data exchange. So really the idea is really to make sure that data of carbon are correctly, transparently, and credible exchange across the entire supply chain, and enable them to make data decision from the different stakeholders. So, and the idea is really to make sure that on one side, one aspect is the data quality, making sure we all have the same information on carbon data. So this is, for the moment, PACT is really, of course, focusing on the carbon and the carbon footprint of the product, making sure that the quality of data is correct and consistently, and then this is available and accessible across the value chain. So in this aspect here is really the protocol for data exchange. So making sure the data can be shared peer-to-peer from the supplier to the client to make sure that then the relevant decision can be taken and aggregated. So, and this is really an initiative that's why a partnership will really bring together multiple stakeholders to address this alignment together. So when it comes to the data exchange, I think this is kind of similar to what Hayley mentioned before. So it's really kind of this passing on the carbon data to make sure that a product or a company has the right, ideally primary data, to make sure that there is the right information and it's possible to track the progress. Because if we use secondary or non-primary data, well, we don't see the progress of the reduction of carbon emissions. So the importance of really of the data exchange is really to make sure that we can measure and quantify the progress done by companies in their product development. So, and that helps then to make further business decisions, improving the sales and reporting, but also design of products and so on. So really driving this knowledge through data and making decisions correctly. So the important thing of the PACT is really to make sure that data are accessible. So really driving the access, standardizing the data, and making sure that it's actionable. One example that they like to use is the PACT is not a database where you get the data in, is really just enabling this, ensuring that A to B are connected. An example is like emails. Emails, you have different service provider, Google, Yahoo, and so on, that kind of different software, but they can communicate to each other by, there is a protocol in between that allow the email to go from one provider to the other, ensuring that this language is correctly used and the other one can use that information to make them use of it. So the PACT is the same, really the protocol that enables this data exchange, peer-to-peer, and so on. So yeah, so I mentioned really the ecosystem, and at the moment the idea, the protocol is being developed, and the focus now is on testing it, making sure that there is some practical examples. So some companies have taken this as a engaging themselves with their supply chain to really test this process. Our objective as well from the built environment side is to understand what are specificity of the built environment that enable or contribute to this discussion to make sure that how the pack get developed is also potentially fit for purpose for the built environment because of its current structures, current information, but also the value chain structure being different than maybe other system like a retail sector or so on. So I think this is really kind of the data aspect is very critical if we want to tackle. But yeah, having such a long value chain in the built environment, how we connect and exchange information is very important. I think the presentation of Lendlease mentioned this as a critical aspect. So here is the information if you want to find out more about this initiative. And if you have questions, so happy to connect, but otherwise you can find the email. That's all from my side.
Luca, thank you very much. That was fantastic. Couple of, well, really big topics, big presentations, but succinctly put. So thank you very much. Really excited to hear the language you're using. I think systems transformation, system-wide collaboration, you're talking about ecosystems. That's very much the worldview that MECLA is applying to challenge to address the challenge of embodied carbon in our network, in our alliance. So I think we're very like-minded in that way. I was interested what you're saying about intensity metrics. They're just not enough when total growth means that we might consume less per square meter of commercial space, but with more square meters, that means emissions go up and planetary boundaries are actually the end game rather than an internal metric from an intensity perspective. Thanks for sharing those resources. We'll make sure they are available for our registered participants today. I'd love to hear of the mashup of fintech and data tech and carbon tech all coming together for our built environment world. That's probably a good segue to kick off the panel discussion, and I'd really encourage Anne and Daryl and also Hayley to put your cameras on and come back into the conversation now. Luca, I'm aware that proxy data is often used in the absence of real data, but when we're looking globally, local data also matters. The data of a European input is likely to be different to an Australian or a Pacific input. How is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development thinking about that?
You correctly said, I mean, you mentioned before as well, I think, like the importance to have primary data is crucial. So to make sure that we don't make wrong understanding or decision. Well, in absence of that secondary data database, well, better than nothing, I would say. So from our side, with the pact work is really to enable these surfacing of this primary data and making sure that they are integrated. And in the built environment work is really, what we really want to do is to ensure that primary data can be easier and better accessible. And ideally, like a decentralized data sharing would be kind of an opportunity to make sure that we access the primary data where they are available, and that, like not necessary to create super database because, well, it's too big, but making sure that data can really be accessed where and when needed will enable them to make sure that every stakeholder can work on their reduction and journey.
Yeah. Thank you. Anne and Daryl, you mentioned 25,000 suppliers. I'm very glad I'm not in charge of running your accounts receivable or accounts payable department. But if you need input data from those 25,000 entities, what happens when a supplier just isn't that mature yet to come up with your numbers? How do you address that transition, which could be quite a long phase?
Yeah, look, really good question. And I think where we're starting our efforts is really around the big ticket items. So we've gone, if you look at our upstream product purchasing, the majority of that sits in some of those really carbon intensive materials. So concrete, structural steel, reinforcing steel, facade elements, so aluminium and glass.
Mhm.
So if we can start really by honing in and focusing on those sectors and those material suppliers, then we'll make some big inroads immediately. But recognise, obviously there's going to be an interim period where we're going to need to fill some of the data gaps using financial proxy data, etc., until the market becomes more mature and we have, a broader set of environmental product declarations for a broader set of products and materials. But I think setting up the right architecture and platforms and systems so that we can start to get that and road test that data sharing platform with the big ticket items first is where we would like to start.
Perfect. Hayley, I might bring you
Yeah.
into the conversation there. Your members and the organizations whose capacity you help build, they're on that transition. I guess that's why they join your school. What's your take on this?
Yeah, and I think it's, like I said, it's a really interesting point when you start talking about putting more and more and more demands on your suppliers as to try and then need to be able to do this within their organizations. Because carbon aside, a lot of people have just recently gone down this journey with sending massive questionnaires out for modern slavery. And what's happened is we've got a situation now where a lot of suppliers are receiving multiple questionnaires from multiple platforms, asking very similar but different questions, asking for people to complete very similar but different training. And it's sort of the multiplier effect of what that has on the supply chain is massive. And yet they're not getting the additional margins to support the extra work to be done in that space. So I talk with a lot of suppliers that saying, yeah, I would love to be able to do all this stuff with modern slavery. I would love to be able to calculate and get third-party verified my scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions, but you're not willing to give me an extra 1% margin on that so I can employ people to do that for me, or I can pay contractors to do that for me. So it is a bit of give and take up and down the supply chain of, guess what, the higher quality is going to get you a high price good, and we need to have that flexibility up and down the supply chain. And it's going to be a little bit like, if you don't move in this place, you won't even be eligible to apply to be working with some of these suppliers. So if you're capable and willing to get on the front foot with this and just include some of this stuff in your business as usual, so it's not an additional add-on because Lendlease is asking you for it. It's just, hey, well, you know what? This is just, if I want to get any work in 5 years' time, I need to know my carbon footprint. So I'm just going to incorporate that into my business as usual operations, how I go about doing that and finding an option for doing that that's cost effective for my size and scale of business. And so it's really interesting to be able to get in that. I did share a link in the chat with people that are interested, because it's one area that the school has then worked with to say, if you want to put your blinkers on for carbon, you want to put your blinkers on for modern slavery, and just, hey, I'm going to set up a data platform to collect and share up and down the supply chain in this one area. It then means that there's multiple platforms to share up and down data for everywhere. So we're trying to adapt our platform, because we already have that connection between suppliers and their supply chain, to allocate training resources and monitor when they're completed, to expand that scope to be able to say, here's some training, but also, can you share with us what your carbon emissions are? And setting a protocol for being able to do that up and down the supply chain, because the system's already half set up and in place to be able to do that. And then making it like there's some universal truths that happen in that space, is that it shouldn't cost people anything to put their data into the platform. So then in terms of a business model, you usually charge the people to extract that out. So the further up the supply chain, if you want to collect your supply chain's data, you pay for the service. But trying to get that whole, encouraging every business to be able to say, come and train, come and put your data into a system, share that data with others, should have zero barriers to entry in terms of getting that done. And then there's the whole question around how you then go out and calculate exactly what data goes into that. And we've had some conversations with people around, do you set a minimum standard that it has to be third-party verified? Is there a lower bar that people can enter at? And then we just have it flexible enough that you can note the sort of systems. Primary data is awesome. If you haven't used primary data, can you use a proxy and then say you've used a proxy as a step one? And then knowing that, your next journey is to say, well, then, the next group of resources I have, I'm going to then try and get my primary data, and then I'm going to try and get it certified, and then I'm going to try and reduce it's a journey that people go on, and being flexible with them to be able to share their data along along that journey, and knowing how accurate or inaccurate and the percentage errors involved in that is just a way of building complexity into an awesome system. But I mean, you've seen my world, so a really complex system diagram operating like that is just, how I get to sleep at night.
Oh, it's a world of messy whiteboards. I can see it right now. Can I ask a question for both Luca and also our friends from Lendlease? And that's around commerciality. So I guess it's a scope 2 issue, but if you know somebody's scope 2 emissions, you might be able to work out where they're getting their electricity and kind of how much they're paying for it, which means you might be able to start working out some of their margin. Are they going to want to share that with you? How do you, and noting that you're going to have multiple suppliers competing with each other, how do companies have the confidence? Luca, you talked about accessible, standardized, and actionable. What about commercially sensitive? Where does that fit? Luca, you first, and then maybe Anne.
Yeah, I mean, currently, the idea is actually indeed that you have a peer-to-peer data exchange that allows kind of to make sure that you know where data goes. So, you have a commercial agreement. And I mean, when you do a procurement, you obviously share your cost. You share how much you are providing the service. So in this case, you also add the information on what is the carbon content of your product. So I mean, this is kind of an important information that would enable decision. So it's not necessarily, potentially also for benchmarking, but it's not necessarily about that. It's really to make sure that the decisions are really of the lowest carbon intensity for the company. But yeah, so these are kind of information that commercially gets shared on the cost sometime. So probably sharing the carbon should not be that kind of different. But on the other side, making sure that you know where this carbon, this data goes, and having control of that, that's of course is critical, because it's different than if you put it on a database which you don't know who and how they get used, compared to have a peer-to-peer exchange.
And what's your take from a Lendlease perspective? Or can't hear you.
I'm thinking a few things here. If you have time to be calculating based on an emissions disclosure from your supplier, what proportion of their margin that might relate to, I would be gobsmacked, particularly in the sort of scale of business that we operate in, and trying to work out where they might be buying that electricity and which market and what kind of deal they may have set up. So I don't think that that's an easy thing to do. So if somebody's disclosing their emissions, I don't think you can go, oh, if that's your emissions, you must be charging me 3 times the amount. And then the other thing is that the proportion of margin or whatever that actually relates to their electricity consumption is probably negligible in comparison to what they might put on top of their labour. If you want to say something, this will pick you up. Go. Did you want to? Daryl was taking his mute button off. Did you want to add to that?
No.
Okay.
All right, so we've busted that myth. That's great. Can I ask the protocol document that you've produced? One of the questions in the Q&A is saying, look, this is a great document, but it could become a quasi standard. Have you thought about that?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Look,
Sure.
we don't obviously see it become, it's our own internal standard. And as we stated, it's version 1, subject to change and input. So obviously, if we start to see others in the space, I think in the Australian context, it's fair to say the people like the Green Building Council of Australia are looking to come out with something very similar. But we'd be keen to sort of work with them and with others, other stakeholders across the industry, to help to try and, I guess, define a little bit more of a standard for our sector.
I think it would be arrogant of us to think that something that we had penned would be considered a standard. Maybe that was a backhanded compliment, I don't know, or a slap. Yeah. I think it's highly probable that when the GBCA, come out with their recommendations and pathways in the new year, which is what they're planning to do, that would probably form some sort of expectation, because they will have to take a much broader industry view. But we are unashamedly saying this has been written for us. However, we are very happy for anybody else to have it, and to take the bits of it that make sense, and for it to be part of a conversation about what an industry standard might be. I think as the ISSB legislation lands in Australia, we will start to see a lot more clarity have to come to fore in terms of what is required, because there is at the moment ISSB are looking to include scope 3 as a requirement at certain stages. So I'm imagining that this space will tighten over time, and maybe this is going to form part of that tightening as it relates to our sector.
That makes sense. And look, I'm not a Lendlease employee, but from a MECLA point of view, we have to openly recognise the leadership that Lendlease is demonstrating and putting the resources into, because it was your document about the time MECLA was getting underway that we co-launched, because you'd made the effort, and there's commercial interest there that if you're going to hit your absolute zero by 2040, the industry's got to move with you. So I think every speaker's talked about collaboration and ecosystem and not being able to do it on our own. That's
absolutely. And we know that there are, other tier 1 organisations who have got the capabilities to be doing this. We've had some conversations with Frasers, for example, who've been on this journey. But we also know that there's tier 2s and 3s and below who would probably be really grateful for somebody else to have done this sort of thinking that they can piggyback and leverage. And I think there's just so much to be done in this space. The more we can all just tip in the bits that we've had a chance to focus on, the better chance we've got as a sector to actually eliminating our emissions.
Absolutely. A question in the Q&A, I'll bring Luca into the conversation. How is Pact Global Standard, how does it relate to the GHG protocol scope 3 guidance, as they're currently working on updating their scope 3 data collection and calculation guideline as well? Have you got coordination with the GHG protocol process?
Yes, because also the greenhouse gas protocol is hosted by WRI and WBCSD. So actually was created 20 years ago by the collaboration of the two organizations. And the review process is now ongoing. And I understand that indeed there is this collaboration on aligning the new or the future development of the greenhouse gas protocol with the Pact. And I understand that this is already ongoing. So yes. But maybe to react to what you mentioned before, I think I definitely want to flag the leadership of Lendlease on this work, because it's really kind of, we need this kind of company taking this effort and sharing this information. I think it's what the sharing it publicly and making sure that it's open and available, encourage the other to do the similar steps, but also inform the other of what can be done and really create this collaboration, and making sure that then effort get combined to really address this challenge jointly. So every pieces of the puzzle can be combined and create this broad effort. So well done.
Wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very conscious of time. We are that a topic like this is so engaging and so pressing that time flies when we're deep in the content. But I'd very much like to thank Luca for dialing in, different time zone, different part of the world, but hearing that international perspective and that alignment is really encouraging. You've given us, MECLA, some homework to get on the phone to the right people in Australian government to get engaged on the Glasgow action. So thank you for giving us that nudge. We'll take that as homework. Daryl and Anne, thank you very much. You are big contributors to MECLA. We really appreciate that. I'd love that. There are a lot of questions here. We didn't get through them all, but I encourage participants today to chase these guys. This is genuinely open discussion, and we as an ecosystem need to move together. So please, MECLA, give your best questions politely to Lendlease on this. The level of thinking that's gone into that, I'm glad it wasn't me that had to review all those protocols around the world, Daryl. Bloody good work, mate. That's a big effort. And Hayley, as ever, your perspective, the introductory piece with the definitions, so important to have that foundation. And I think anyone dialing in here who's got further questions, the resources that you have available would be very helpful. As always, behind the scenes, the Secretariat of MECLA is Monica Richter from WWF, who is tireless in keeping on the phone, on the emails, bringing us together and keeping us moving forward. So Monica, dialing in from Brisbane today, a big thank you to Alexi Barnstone and Kadi Vahan from Climate Kick. We couldn't do it without you guys. So thank you for making today possible, making it happen. That's it for now. MECLA, thank you very much. We're a do tank. This is some of the doing of sharing the information and seeking feedback. So let's keep going. I look forward to seeing you online sometime soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.